Okay, it's 7 o'clock. We are going to start with our workshop from 7 until 7:30 and then begin our regular meeting agenda at 7:30. And so with that, thank you, Natalie. It looks like you're teed up.
Yep.
We're going to spend a little time talking about special use permits, what they are, how they work.
Yes.
And I think as well, you were going to touch on HDLO.
It comes up in here as one of the special use permits with additional regulations.
Great.
Yeah. So, following off, the first meeting, January, Jennifer went over kind of the board's procedures. So we're going to try and follow some of the bigger kind of chunks of the code to remind the board and the public of the board's jurisdiction. So special use permits are just one of the items under the planning board's jurisdiction, right? You also have site plan, subdivision, and certificates of appropriateness, and then special use permits. So we'll just go through today kind of what is a special use permit. We'll talk about special use permit review as it's kind of outlined in the City of Beacon's code. We'll go through the appropriateness of requesting variances from special use permit standards, and then also kind of final determinations and conditions that can be placed on special use permits. So what is a special use permit? It's a use that is allowed in a district. It just is subject to compliance with certain standards. So sometimes special uses get confused with variances, right? So unlike a variance, which gives a property owner the right to use their property in a way that is inconsistent with the code, special uses are consistent with the code. They just have additional stipulations kind of placed on them that the board must review.
It's kind of like another layer, if you will.
It's just
to
another
the
layer,
underlying
right?
zoning.
So, and we'll
Yep.
go through that when we get into, we'll look at the bulk table and kind of talk about certain uses that are special permit in one district and not in others, and we'll talk about why that may be. So, actually, we're there now, so we'll talk about that now. So, kind of as Jennifer went over in the last meeting, right, that the legislative body, the city council sets the code, right? So they are the ones deciding kind of what uses are permitted in some districts, permitted by special use permits in other, or prohibited in others. And the planning board is responsible for kind of implementing that as the code is written and adopted by the legislative body. So the first step when you're looking at a use, just for folks, there is the special use, or the use regulations are in section 223-17, or it's also attachment 2 of the code. So when you're looking online at the zoning code, it'll be kind of up at the top as an attachment, and you'll get this table, and there's 2 pages of it. I know it's a little hard to see. Let me see if I can kind of zoom in a little bit here. So what you have on the left-hand side is a list of all uses, or most uses, or general uses, and then across the top you have each of the zoning districts kind of identified. And then so uses are categorized by use and by district. So a use that is permitted in one district may be excluded in another, or it may be, may require a special permit. City of Beacon also has, as you can see down here, special uses are identified by SP, if it's a special use that needs to be reviewed by the planning board. And then if there's an asterisk next to that, that is a special use that is specifically reviewed by the city council. And just so, for example, let's look at parking structures as an accessory use, right? So that's one that, zoom back out a little bit, in the T district here, it is a special use permit, but in the CMS district, or the linkage district, or the waterfront district, it is permitted by right. And so why that choice was likely made by the legislative body is, the T district is a little bit more of a kind of mix, right? It changes in densities, changes in heights and structures. So it's going to be a little bit more sensitive about whether that structured parking will be appropriate to the context of that neighborhood. So that's why it's been designated special use, and there's regulations that the board would look at when reviewing that. So we just went over kind of the list of uses that are identified and how you would identify that. The approval authority is the next step. Jennifer, I'm going to give you credit because I stole your, this is your presentation, I'm just redoing it. Approval authority, the legislative body, as I said, the city council here, they are the ones vested with the right of reviewing special use permits, but they can designate that authority to either the planning board or the zoning board of appeals, or they can retain that authority for themselves, as they have done for some uses. and for example, you know, the city of Beacon has been kind of moving through, moving many of the special use permits to review by the planning board rather than the city council. One that we kind of talked about the last time that it's been moving down in its review is accessory apartments, right? So that used to be under the authority of the city council solely, then it got moved to the planning board, and then in the last revision to the code, a lot of that authority for those approvals has actually been given to staff in terms of reviewing certain accessory apartments. So then we'll get into kind of procedure.
When you say staff, you mean building department?
Building department.
Yep.
The building inspector, zoning enforcement officer. And then, so the next step that we'll kind of talk about, and this is what we'll go through the rest of the presentation, is really kind of the procedure, right? So the zoning code specifies the procedure that must be followed and the specific criteria for review. So again, that is code and language that is adopted by the city council and then put before the planning board. So, you know, the regulations talk about everything from how many copies of applications are needed, timeline, what the public hearing notification process is. Public hearings are required for all special uses by state law. So obviously, again, in Poughkeepsie, or in Beacon, they are also required here. There's timelines in terms of after the closing of the public hearing, how many days does the planning board have to make decisions? That's all outlined in the code. And then also kind of the expiration of these permits. So if they're issued, specifically in the city of Beacon, if a special permit is issued, it expires within a year if a building permit is not pulled for that. And then that applicant would need to come back before the board to get that special permit again. So they don't kind of run with the property forever if they're not acted on.
There are instances where special permits will need to be renewed, correct?
Yes, I'd have to look at each one to see if there's that specific in the code, but we'll get to kind of conditions and
Yeah.
things that can be placed. And so often what you'll see for special use permits is there's an option, you know, that you can put a timeline, you know, within 2 years, have this information submitted so the board can re-review it. Also, something quite unique about the city of Beacon is that the building inspector does have the authority to revoke a special use permit if conditions or the stipulations in the code are not being met. For example, if hours of operation are placed on a use, right, that you cannot be operating past 10 p.m., or that you must have, you know, some kind of shuttle or something in place, if it's found that that operation is not occurring, the special use permit can be revoked.
How is that unique to Beacon? Aren't other municipalities that sophisticated?
I
No?
guess, not all, I'd have to look through other communities I work in that's not expressly stated in the code that can be that can be revoked like that. Okay, so again, text is small here, but you know, just so everyone knows, this is section 223-18 of the code. These are the general special use standards. So these apply to all special uses in any district, right? And so these 6 kind of regulate some of the larger areas, I think, of uses, right? Looking at the location and size of the use and the hours of operation and intensity, looking specifically at where the buildings are placed and walls and landscaping and kind of screening those from adjacent uses. There's also looking at making sure that the operations are not more objectionable than other uses permitted within that district. So that is something kind of helpful if you are looking at a special use permit or special use, and there are conversations about impacts in terms of, you know, number of people coming there or traffic. It is helpful for the board to kind of look at that in comparison to other uses that are permitted in that district, right? Parking areas, right? There's specific kind of stipulations regarding parking areas being of adequate size and not causing unreasonable traffic congestion. Which is kind of something standard that the board looks at for most uses, but is expressly stated for special permit uses. Obviously, accessibility for emergency services and making sure proper infrastructure to serve that special use. And then finally, that the special use is in line with the comprehensive plan and, if applicable, the local waterfront revitalization program, the LWRP. So that's the general ones, right, that apply to everything. Then there are also specific specific standards that apply to specific uses. So in addition, it's kind of, again, another layer, right? There's that general stipulations, and then there's the additional layer of specific standards for specific uses. And so Beacon has some for bed and breakfasts, hotels, and then we'll get into some for specifically special uses within the historic districts. But here's just an example one for bed and breakfast businesses. So I won't go through all of these specifically, but some of them are kind of numerical, right? Looking at the minimum lot size that you must have, or the number of bedrooms, the permitted number of bedrooms that you can have. And then some of them are a little bit more kind of, I guess, up to the review and discussion of the board.
Actually, that's a good example. I just maybe go a little bit deeper, right?
Yeah.
For example, in certain districts, bed and breakfasts are allowed under special use, right? Mm-hmm. So, for example, in a potentially residential district,
Yes.
right?
Yep, so all the R1, all the RD and T districts, bed and breakfast are special permit.
Got it, right. So again, that's,
And then in the waterfront district, there's special permit, in the waterfront park district, there's special permit reviewed by the council. Not the
For-
planning- For bed and breakfast.
bed and breakfast.
Yep.
Okay, interesting. So there's, interesting.
Yeah.
Different layers of special use, different districts, but same use. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and so just to the point, like, some of them are talking about must be this certain size, and then some of them are more up to the discretion of the board in terms of talking about, adequate screening from adjacent residential uses, right? So there's not a set number of what that screening must be or what that landscaping must look like, but the board is charged with giving that an extra hard look and evaluating screening from adjacent properties there. And then one I wanted to talk about specifically is there is a section in the Beacon Code that, uses permitted by special permit in the HDL, in the Historic District Landmark Overlay. Why I wanted to point this out specifically too is this isn't necessarily identified in that chart, in that table that I had originally kind of pointed to. These are specific to the overlay district, the Historic Overlay District, and these uses are outlined just in this code. So this is one area where if you're just looking at the use table, you wouldn't necessarily know that these uses are permitted by special permit in this district. So it's helpful to kind of go here to see what uses can be in that overlay district. So we'll just kind of go through these. One grouping of uses that is permitted by special permit is specialized businesses, normally associated with kind of history, arts, culture, appropriate to the structure and compatible with the neighborhood. And some examples here are artist studios, antique shops, very specific rare book, coin, stamp shops, or similar types of uses, again, determined by the planning board. So these kind of novelty uses are permitted as a special use in the historic district. Residential, hotel, or professional uses, provided that they are appropriate to the structure, compatible with the neighborhood, and are located on a road that can accommodate increased traffic as determined by the planning board. These uses may include, they talk about restaurants, bed and breakfast come up again, professional offices, multifamily residential, artist live workspaces, and hotels and hotel-related accessory uses. And then some of these, there's even another layer if you get down, but this is kind of just talking about the special uses that are permitted. And then there's additional standards for this, right? Special permits are warranted only under certain conditions in the historic district. So notwithstanding the limitations kind of that we went through before in subsection B, the planning board may approve a special permit for any of the uses that we just kind of went through and may allow a larger number of seats, employees, dwellings, or live workspaces if they determine that a larger number is warranted by certain criteria. And those criteria can be building size, building configuration, nature of the proposed preservation, historic nature and context of the building. And then, so the purpose of this, I just kind of stepping back and trying to think about what these regulations are allowing, right, is that historic buildings and historic sites don't come in all one sort of shape and size, right? So what the legislative body is trying to do with these regulations is give guidance and flexibility to the code, right? Because the goal here is to preserve historic structures within the city of Beacon, and it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of job, right? So these are kind of parameters for the board to function within.
Maybe I'm wrong, but I interpreted that to mean that what you just described in a district, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I probably am, but that before a special use permit can be invoked, if you will, certain base conditions need to be met. Am I interpreting that right?
What do you mean? In terms before they can apply, or?
Yeah, before you can actually say, well, I'd like to approach this special use permit.
You would have to be one of the uses listed,
Yeah.
right? And I think there would need to be a zoning there'd need to be a determination from the building department kind of categorizing you within one of those uses that are permitted. And then some of them, some of the direct stipulations in terms of square footage of the site or number of rooms, I think that would also be caught during the initial review
Yeah.
by the building inspector. But I think this is, the section I just went through in terms of these certain conditions that warrant a larger size. These are very much this is up to the discretion of the planning board, right?
Okay.
The planning board may approve a special permit. So the application would still get before you, but you would be responsible for going through these criteria.
That's helpful. Yeah, I did interpret it wrong, but
Okay.
thank you.
Okay,
That's
yeah.
very helpful.
And then findings, so the planning board must make the following findings before, so this is now before you can kind of make that actual approval, right? That any exterior restoration shall maintain the architectural and historic integrity of the structure. Any new construction shall be compatible with neighboring structures, so you're looking at the context of the neighborhood. The proposed use is compatible with the neighborhood, and activities permitted within the structure can be adequately buffered from any surrounding residential homes. Resulting traffic generation will not overburden existing roads, and adequate parking can be provided without unduly destroying the landscape or the setting of the structure. And the proposed use is appropriate to the structure, will aid in the preservation of the structure, and will not result in undue alterations or enlargement of the structure. So that's those are just two examples, right? You have other uses within your code that have those specific parameters. But then I just have two more slides that I think we want to wrap up with in terms of variance and waivers. So it is still possible. There are these kind of stipulations within the special use regulations, but an applicant can still seek, they cannot still seek a variance to remove that if it's causing a burden on the site, right? So where proposed special use,
Say that again?
you can still seek a variance, right, that you could, from relief from these sections of the code. So say there's a stipulation, a special use permit that says you must have a 4,000 square foot parcel in order to have this special use.
Oh, so actually, back to my original, you confirmed what I was assuming. So
Now you are right?
There are some baseline, yes, there are some baseline conditions that need to be in place for a special use
Yeah,
to be considered. And so now you're talking about sort of a new element to special use, variances can be sought.
yeah. Well, it's interesting because it kind of, I think this is where the code gets tricky, right? So there could be one that is, so the stipulation says that, say you can only have 6 bedrooms and a bed and breakfast, right? But there's a specific section in the code, that one that we were just looking at, section C, that allows vests the planning board with the right to go over 6 units. So you would be the first step to review that,
Right.
and the board would review whether or not, say they were proposing 8 units, is appropriate. If this board deemed that it was not, then the applicant could still apply to the ZBA and seek a variance. So that's almost two-pronged there. Like,
Interesting. I don't think I've ever seen that happen before, but that's interesting.
that someone would come to the planning, yeah, I haven't been here long enough to know.
Another good example, a lot of times you'll see like distance requirements in the code for a special permit, like for gas stations, for example, you can't have a gas station within 1,000 feet of another gas station.
Yeah.
Someone could seek a variance to allow a gas station to be 800 feet from another gas
Yeah.
station.
Yeah.
And that would be an area variance. Even though it's a special use permit standard, you could still seek
They
a
could go for
variance from that
variance.
standard.
Yeah, but even this nuance of, where it somewhat falls under the planning board purview to
It would have
make
to
a
be stated in the
determination.
code that the planning board has that
Right.
authority,
That's
right?
the first step.
But then to
Yeah.
see an applicant not necessarily agree with that and go to the zoning board, that's unique.
Yeah, there's
Interesting.
there's usually a release valve for most
Yeah, no, it's,
regulations and codes.
that's good. It makes sense that there is.
But I think for the example that Jennifer gave, if it doesn't specifically say in the code, the planning board can deviate from this distance.
Yeah.
They can't come to you and make that case. They have to go
They
to
have
the
to go to
ZBA and
ZBA,
make that
yeah.
case.
Right.
But there are, for example, in the historic overlay district, there are some additional parameters given to the planning board in terms of jurisdiction to be flexible with those numbers.
Yeah.
You see that too, not under special permit parameters, but for parking within your code. There's a lot of, well, under the new code, it's a little different, but under the previous parking code, you could issue waivers for parking, right?
Yeah,
if
I remember
certain
that.
Things were made. So the applicant wouldn't have to automatically go to the zoning board to seek a variance. You had authority built in to the code for waivers, and it's the same thing here. It's just authority built into the code for you to issue
Yeah.
a waiver instead of automatically going to the zoning board.
That term waiver, for some reason, came up as being one that wasn't necessarily appropriate.
Waiver, the planning board issues waivers, zoning board issues variances.
Yeah.
Essentially, they're kind of the same thing when you drill down into it, but
Yeah.
Are there limits to our waiver purview? Like what can be waived?
it depends on the circumstance in the code.
It's
all,
itemized in the code
it would
whether
all be,
something can be
yeah,
It's all written down.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, and in general, there's been a move, I've seen a lot of communities moving from like building in ability for waivers into the planning board to give the planning board more flexibility to review a site plan rather than always necessarily sending it back to the ZBA, the zoning board, because the zoning board has very specific criteria for what they're looking at in terms of granting variances. So if it is something that the legislative body understands to require more flexibility or something that they see may be appropriate, they'll likely give the waiver ability to the planning board instead of requiring a variance.
In your experience on the ZBA, had you ever come across applications where you thought, gee, I wish the planning board were looking at this rather than zoning? Just curious.
Yeah, definitely, and in particular, where you have something like, an area variance with regard to some dimensional regulation, but it was, the whole thing was part of a larger site plan approval, and the reality is how well this fits in is something that was a lot more in front of the planning board
Interesting.
than us.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, as you noted, if it's actually being characterized as a variance, then there's a relatively specific standard that applies.
Yeah.
Whereas in front of us, it's basically going to be whatever standard city council has put in to cover
Yeah.
the waiver.
Yeah.
So it's going to, I would say in broad strokes, it's going to signal an increased legislative receptiveness to adjustments that are in those categories taking place.
And then just one last slide. So at the end, when the planning board is making a determination with regards to a special use permit, the board does have the authority to impose reasonable conditions and restrictions as long as they are directly related and incidental to the proposed special use. So they do have to have some kind of nexus connecting them to the use that's being reviewed. And then I stole this case law from Jennifer's last presentation, where the courts decided that a condition must be related to the use of the property and not the applicant or owner. And I think the example that was in this case was the Wegmans. This was the Wegmans case where the board tried to say that, the special use is permitted, but only if the supermarket is a Wegmans.
Wait, who tried to do that?
Sorry, Whole Foods.
The town of Gates,
And the planning board did that, or the council?
town board,
The town board?
yeah. And deciding whether or not, where that special use could be granted, or making it a condition of the special use. So you can't make the special use, or for example, say somebody owns a bunch of properties and maybe someone has had some violations or something on another property in the city. I don't think it would, and Jennifer, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think it would necessarily be appropriate to add conditions to that property owner.
Yeah, this law applies to everybody but Dave Smith.
Yeah, exactly. And Dave Smith, we don't trust you, so we're gonna put like
we're
these
gonna
extra
put more
conditions
layers
that are
on it.
related to you, not
Right.
as an operator, not as the use itself.
Yeah.
So you should, if there are conditions being placed, they should be applied directly to the use and be reasonable in terms of regulating that use. So that's the intro to special use regulations.
Nice, thank you.
Yep.
Very helpful. We have a few minutes. Any questions on the subject matter?
Riveting stuff.
It is. Next month, we're going to make John do SWIPs.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
planning.
Wasn't there just new regulations adopted? You can walk us through that.
You really don't want to go through that?
No?
Section by section.
You got all night?
We have 5 minutes left in our workshop. Anything you want to add? to
No, sir.
Special use?
No, sir.
Or are there any topics that the board would like to see covered for training sessions in the future?
That's a really good use of the next 5 minutes.
Right.
Because we usually come to the afternoon call and scratch our
talking
heads
about
about
today?
what's good topic. Although, I thought the conversation today was rather useful, just in terms of the,
Yeah.
ULURP 101 stuff.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, any other ideas you guys have on subject content for our workshops, throw them out. Anything come to mind for you?
Think for a minute.
Yeah.
Yeah,
give
we've
it some
never
thought.
gotten around to discussing, having a discussion about, with the council about changes that we might recommend or things that they might want to look at. Current zoning regulations that we've had to struggle dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, if it were workshop worthy, we might want to be a little bit more specific on things that we want to specifically workshop to potentially bring to, as it would be notes or recommendations to the city council. So, yeah, I think that's a good use of workshop time.
Specifically, the transition zone is the one that
This microphone.
yeah.
I can't hear you on the video.
I think we've struggled with the transition zone and some of the ways that buildings, the regulations involved with that.
Yeah.
I have a procedural question to that end. If a member of the board has an issue like that where they have a recommendation ready to go, can they move in any regular session to make a recommendation to the city council and then let the board vote on it? Or would we prefer to, like you said, kind of collect those things and do it in a special workshop or?
But you have I think, a couple of avenues. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it would be, regardless of the mechanism, it would be something presented to the council for consideration, right?
By the
So-
planning board as a whole.
So,
Yeah.
so the two mechanisms are, we could do it as a board, or you could do it as a private
As an individual,
citizen.
right,
Yeah,
any of
that's
us
true.
at any
Yeah.
time.
Right,
And-
right.
And any of us at any time could make a recommendation to the city council.
So if you feel like, you'd want the board's input and the sort of, I guess, weight of the board on these recommendations, yeah, let's put them on the table, let's talk about them, let's workshop them.
Yeah, I think it'd be useful to have everybody's, a broad, a cross-section of the opinion of the board on some of these issues. Rather than just having it be one issue that then gets voted up or down, But it's like,
Yeah.
share our experience and get it I would recommend that it be structured with an agenda and points to cover so that it's useful and it can, anyway.
Agreed.
That's my, yeah.
So we would have to, because to clarify one more thing. I think we've been told that it's not ideal for us to be doing emails to the whole board because it's almost becomes like a meeting, right? So we're not,
Yeah.
we're
Yeah.
encouraged not to communicate in that regard. So we'd have to remind ourselves to hey, 2 months from now, we want to have a workshop. Everybody get a slate of things, and then maybe we give them all to
So-
John, or we give them all to Jennifer individually, and and then we
Yeah,
work our way through 'em.
But myself and Mercedes are the sort of the conduits through
Okay.
which, we would organize that to create, first to collect the ideas and then create an agenda from those ideas to be discussed at a
Yeah,
workshop.
so there's nothing wrong with us, as a board, in our official capacity, through city email, sharing content ideas with Mercedes and
Right,
Jennifer.
but we
on-
can't,
Yeah,
we can't
absolutely.
all be emailing each other, though.
No, we can't have
can't-
substantive
No,
discussion about
right.
it.
Directly
We
with
can
each other
simply-
over email. That's
Exactly.
open meeting.
We can
law.
make lists. Yes, we're good at that, right? Put it in a spreadsheet, Excel. We can do Excel. So, but yeah, great idea. So start to think about what topics might be useful and let's compile them.
Yeah.
Great. Well, that was productive. Wow, 2025 is off to a bang.